Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Veronica Riera-Gilley of Prairie Fire Pharmacy Consulting, and we're here tonight on Embracing Mortality, and the topic is green burial. And I'm really excited that we have Ann Hoffner. She is the author of the Natural Burial Cemetery Guide, and it's in its second edition. And she's here to talk to us about her book and about green burial and things that we should know about that. So Ann, welcome. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, can you tell us about yourself and about your first experience with green burial?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story as to how I got into green burial. I'm a writer, a journalist, and a sailing marine journalist, and you can see I'm on a boat right now. But when I was researching plastics recycling, I'd come back from 10 years on a boat, and I came upon this term called green burial. This was about 9 years ago, and I had never heard it before, so I set it aside to look up later. And when I started to look into it, it was all about the burial of the body green, and I started to get involved in that. And my first inclination to write about it, because I wanted to pursue and make the subject more available to everybody, was I was going to write a whole book about the history of funerals and the history of burials and how it got to green burial. And then it took so long to contact cemeteries that did green burial. I mean, it just took me days and days and days, often, sometimes not the case, but often, that I thought, this is, the average person isn't going to bother to go through all this. So I decided to write a guidebook and put all the information that I had learned into that, so that the consumer could avoid all that. And I started out with a book about the Northeast and expanded to the full US. So, and that's where we are now with the Natural Burial Cemetery Guide, of which your guest is in it. So
Yes, I'm so excited that you had this guide, because I was having trouble as I was searching in my own community for green burial resources, and just Googling it, I couldn't find what I was looking for. And then once I purchased your book, I was able to contact Michael, who runs the Green Tree Burial in Oklahoma, and I got to go and visit, and it was a beautiful place, and I was excited to be connected to him through your book.
Yeah, well, that's the idea, to make it easier, because the only way that it's going to actually expand is by people wanting it. And sometimes it requires people going out and asking, hey, I don't have green burial here, why not? And helping to start stuff up. So, yeah.
That's really great. So what is your definition of green burial?
Well, green burial, it's basically being buried in the ground with minimal coverings, something that's environmentally acceptable, a wicker basket, a shroud, and doing the minimum to the environment in which it's done. No big equipment that being used to open up the grave, minimal fertilizers and chemicals on the grass above it. And it's an attitude. To me, it's an attitude about how you are being buried, that you're trying to do good. I see the body as the last thing that we have to give to the earth. I mean, we're not alive to give it, okay, and we're leaving it to the rest of us, to our survivors, to take care of. And you might as well at least not do any harm. And if you can do good. So, and green burial is it has different connotations, but so I think there's another term for it, which is the natural burial has a slightly it doesn't have just the environmental sense, and it has to do with saving land. It has to do with recovering kind of land that has been abused, and putting land into conservation. And so it incorporates the green principles with also a broader mission to save land. So
That's good. I hadn't heard that distinction between the green and the natural burial before. I kind of thought they were one of the same.
no, they actually, well, people use them kind of interchangeably, but they can be, but they really, if you think of the distinctions, they make a lot of sense. So.
And so can you tell us what are the principles of green burial?
Well, green burial, there's several levels of green burial. Okay, green burial is a basic term, but it the lowest level is to not use harmful chemicals when you bury a body, not to use a biodegradable container for the body if you're going to use any container at all, and the it goes up from several levels. You've got hybrid burial, okay, which can be burial within a conventional cemetery, where you have that green burial in a hole, hopefully dug with shovels and without with a biodegradable casket and no chemicals. And then you move up to a natural burial, which is done in a ground that makes an attempt to salvage the land that's in it. It's not a conventional cemetery. It's either a new ground that has been established as a cemetery or an old one, but that it's done with a purpose for the land. And you've got conservation burial, which is a third level. And that takes the green burial and the natural burial and adds in protections for the land. So a conservation burial is a very extremely hard to reach, because you have to be associated, either you have to be a nature preserve yourself or associated with a nature preserve, so that the strictures on the use of the land are assured down through the ages, either in the deed or through a connection with a conservation organization of some sort. So it covers, the green covers, what I'm trying to say is green covers a whole variety of levels. And some people say, green is what you want it to be. And anything from the desire to do no harm up to the strictest kinds of levels. And some people will claim that a cemetery that doesn't do the ultimate is not really green, but I have a feeling that it's an attitude as much as anything.
I really like the idea that you presented in your book, that we should care as much about what we put in our bodies while we're alive as what we put in our bodies in the process of being buried. So even in death, that we care about the treatment of our bodies and the toxic burden that we're putting into our body, even though that toxic burden doesn't affect us if we're dead, but it does have an impact on the environment. So caring, even though we're not here to see the result.
Well, see, that's, I think, what's part of what I'm, the important thing to me is that we should care about what happens with our body, okay? Because it's a big thing. It's a big thing we're leaving behind. And I've run into at least one cemeterian who said, I've had people come, and people who've had cancer and radiation and chemo, and they've had kids, and the last thing they want to do is have them be buried in places with lots of chemicals, be embalmed and those kinds of things. So there's a sense that, yeah, if we're the whole food generation, why would we then want to go and have a chemically embalmed and nasty body and buried in a place with with the mahogany caskets that don't degrade, or the metal ones and stuff like that. It's an attitude. I think it's an attitude, and it entails also discussing burial. I mean, most of us don't discuss with our children, with our our parents and all what we would like to have done. And that's part of, you have to understand what we're doing before we can do it.
I think that's a great point to bring up, that a lot of people don't discuss it and don't know that they have options. I had a friend who recently lost her mother and had the idea that she did not want embalming, and she didn't know that she would need to ask, that the funeral home just, I guess, assumed everyone wanted embalming, and she didn't. You can't undo that. And so um, to let people know, hey, there are options and you should ask.
Well, also there are green burial cemeteries which will not bury you if you've been embalmed, and that's a shame, because there often are people who are embalmed before they even know that. And but it's not, and a lot of people think that that's state law, that there's some sort of law that says you have to be embalmed, and that's actually not true. So there's a lot of, I don't necessarily believe that the funeral industry is deliberately telling us things. I think that often it's a miscommunication or lack of communicating things that are their options. And that's a green burial, again, is about options. I mean, being able to choose, saying, I don't want this, or I do want that. I don't want embalming. I'd like to be embalmed, but I'd like to have it be natural. I mean, and I think people like you can help help people understand those options before they go. And I think it also has to be stated before you do. You have to state your own desires. You can't leave it up to
Absolutely.
somebody. Yeah.
And you've got to talk about it well before you're sick, because no one likes to make decisions under pressure and under duress. So talking about it before there's other critical medical decisions that need to be made.
Well, and also you can't leave it up to your survivors. I mean, often if you don't set, tell people what you want, the easiest thing when you die is going to be to bury you in the local cemetery. There was a great story, and this is just a digression, but in Steelmantown, Ed Bixby, who runs the cemetery where I buried my parents, one of the times we visited him, he told us about a guy. He's a turtle scientist in Philadelphia, and he heard that there's turtles in Ed Bixby Steelmantown Cemetery, and every year this guy goes out for several months in the summertime to study turtles in the wilderness, and he bought a plot at Steelmantown because he wanted to be buried among the turtles. But what he did, because he knew he was going to be alone during those times, he had a T-shirt made for every day of the week, and it said, if I die, I want to be buried. I have a plot at Steelmantown Cemetery, so that if somebody found him, they would know what to do with his body. And that sounds extreme, but I think sometimes it's really necessary to go to the extremes in order to get what you want.
So when you were writing the book, did you find that there were more of any one type of these green burial funerals available, or not funerals, excuse me, cemeteries available, like more hybrids over natural versus conservation? Like, did you find that there was more of one type than any other?
There are very few conservation because of the difficulty of actually achieving certification for them. People talk about having conservation burials, but there's only about 7 in the country. Whereas I think my latest book has maybe 160 cemeteries all told, and that's not all of them. So the large majority are hybrid, which makes a lot of sense because they're easier to set up and they're easier to have in your hometown. The second number of likely ones are natural, but so I'd say there's the hybrid first, natural second, and then the third. And there are quite a few that are religious cemeteries. The Catholics have really adopted green burial on a large scale, which is interesting because the Pope actually came out with an encyclical which encouraged, said that it's within the keepings of the liturgy. But there's a lot of Jewish green burial cemeteries, which is unusual because one is often said, hey, green burial, Jewish burial is very much green burial, but it's not the choice that green burial is. So those two make up a significant portion of them, actually.
So can you describe to us what a hybrid cemetery looks like compared to the other two, natural and conservation? Because I have not been to a hybrid cemetery,
Mhm.
but I have been to a natural. I should ask Michael if he's working for conservation status on his. I haven't asked him that yet.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Well, you can ask him. That'd be an interesting question to ask him. And the hybrid is the first one that I saw. Okay, so when I think it was 2012 or 13, when I started to pursue this idea, I wanted to go see one. Obviously, so Northern New Jersey had a, a Catholic cemetery called Mary Rest in a little town called Mawa, and we did a tour, my husband and I, of various kinds of conventional cemeteries, and we came to this Catholic cemetery, and it was full of headstones. The Catholics are fairly egalitarian. You don't have the fancy kind of stones that you might in Mount Auburn and historical cemeteries. So we're walking around, and we finally found the green area. And I'm looking out over a little area of wooded stuff, and I thought, there's just this chill went through me, just an absolute chill. I thought, wow, there's bodies just there buried, rolling around together. They don't have coffins. They don't have, there's nothing keeping them from the earth. And it was for me, an oddly revelatory experience. And that was very much a hybrid, because most of the cemetery was what you would exactly think of as the conventional. And a natural cemetery, what you've seen, can often have no tombstones. I mean, I'm not sure. Which did you see?
I went to the Green Tree burial in Oklahoma, and it it looked very natural. You wouldn't know unless someone told you what was there. There were a few little paths mowed among trees and the bushes, just kind of like on the perimeter. But the
Right.
rest of it, you would have to walk through, and it was very beautiful and untouched, and just a very few number of places that were mowed and made for walking. Um, just everything was just very natural, and I think unless you put some sort of marker, either like I think there were a few little lanterns hung where there were some um, animals buried on the property, or if families had put a stone, but other than that, I mean, you'd have to be looking for some
For the
sign that wasn't part of the natural environment to know if anyone was buried there.
Well, that's actually the interesting thing. Was what struck me about Mawa was that was the case with the green burial part. But sometimes hybrids can be done, burial scattered within the conventional ones. In Mount Auburn, often the historical places will have little places within them, that so you don't get that sense of natural. And Massachusetts has, in Massachusetts, I think maybe other New England states, they're required to have cemeteries, burial grounds for the residents. Each town has them. So they will have these small municipal cemeteries, and scattered among the conventional graves will be green. So that's a very different experience. And there are many people who say that hybrids aren't really green, but to me, the average person is much more likely to encounter a green cemetery than a hybrid cemetery than they are the other ones. So, hey, it's green.
And I have found in talking to people that many people really like knowing that there's a specific resting place and having that marker for their loved one. And so the idea of a hybrid really helps, I think, bridge the gap where we're asking for people to do something outside of what's considered the conventional norm, but yet we're still keeping a piece of what feels very familiar. And
Oh,
those traditions built around the funeral process are important to keep. particularly if they bring you comfort. And so, like talking to people, the idea of going into a hybrid cemetery was much more likely than a natural burial setting because it seemed so far removed from what was familiar to them. And I've had a lot of people express, well, I want to go back and be able to go visit where mom is buried.
I mean, that's an interesting insight, Veronica. Wow. Okay, I'll have to remember that. Excuse me. Yeah, the comfort of the familiar, basically is what you're talking about, and also I think that it also means that if one person wants to be buried conventionally, somebody else can be buried green, but also be in the same cemetery, which is an interest, which is essentially an extension of what you're saying. So, yeah, good one.
Well, I think I've expressed this to you before, but I'll share it for our listeners. As I'm still wrestling with the idea of if I want a natural burial for myself. I know I definitely want to take a greener choice, but cremation is what we've always done in my family, and I love this idea of someone loving my energy and wanting to put me on the shelf. You know, that they love having me nearby, and you know, maybe my kids don't want to put me on the shelf. So maybe I do want to choose a natural burial where I go in the ground and I can actually be recycled to the earth, because maybe that's my attachment. That it's my own ego that wants to be on the shelf.
Well, the only thing that I would say to that is that my family, both my husband's and my families have had histories recently of cremation, and there's no place to visit. You know, my parents having graves, it feels like a comfort level, even though cemeterians say, you know, beyond the second generation, people don't go, but there's a sense that that place has that. And you lose that. We've always scattered ashes, which is very different from what you're saying. You know, having you on the mantle is a different kind of. But it also cremation assuages people's sense that they're using up land. I mean, I think that I've run into people who really resist the idea of green burial because it still takes up land, and you know that's a legitimate question. That's a legitimate issue. So you're you just the only thing I would say to you, think about the consequences of burning you. And it's not just, you know, it's not the pollution, it's all that good stuff in you, Veronica. I mean, you've spent a lifetime creating good stuff in your body, and you're going to burn it up. So anyway.
No, I agree, and that's a lot to think about. Is that you're not really being returned to the earth when you
Right.
do cremation.
Right.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about.
Right. But then this whole thing is a lot to think about. We're thinking about one of the deepest kind of issues in, you know, in life or death. So yeah, it's interesting.
What was the most surprising thing that you learned from researching and writing your book?
The most surprising thing, well, the most surprising thing was that I didn't find myself being weirded out by it all. I mean, I guess maybe that seems like a personal thing, but I always thought of death as being something I didn't want to deal with. I didn't want to deal with my own death. I didn't want to deal with a relative's death or a friend. But once I started to delve into the physical nature of it, and I the cemeteries are really what the part of it is. It's become much more of a not just an interest, but a part of my life. And I find most people don't want to talk about that. And I think most people don't get the fact that the understanding of it and the closeness to it can make it all much more of a part of you. So that's maybe a simple answer, but I think that's the deepest thing for me.
That's really good, and I'm excited to hear you express that it didn't weird you out, and that talking about it was a good process, because I hope that's encouraging to other people as we're encouraging them to have that conversation, and they might have the same surprise that culturally I think we're told to be weirded out by it, and we don't have to be.
But you're not weirded out, are you?
No, no, not at all. And um, like being a death doula interests me, and I'm a board certified geriatric pharmacist. So I feel like death is just very much an important piece of my work. If I don't help people deal with it and embrace it, I've done them a disservice, because we can't keep medicating you and prolonging your life artificially. We have a life cycle, and we need to embrace it, because we bring more pain and suffering when we resist it.
Well, also, you've got a child there. I mean, one of the most interesting experiences I had was I was invited into a middle school to talk about green burial, and those kids were great. They didn't have the weirdness about death that we have. I mean, I think there's a point at which you can talk. I mean, up until people like in their 60s, and then people go, "Whoa," I don't want to think about that. But there are cycles in terms of being accepting death as part of life, and so that what is it in children that is able to accept it and see it as natural or normal. And I'm not sure we can take that in, but it's an interesting subject.
They're so open, like
Yeah.
their minds are just so open, and they're not
Not
fixed.
creeped out. They're not creeped out. Yeah.
Kids are awesome.
That's true.
Well, the last question that I have for you this evening is there any particularly memorable or unique burial ground that stood out to you while researching the book?
Well, researching took a couple different levels for me. I researched all of the 161 cemeteries that I have in the book, but I visited, a number of them. And I think the ones that I visited were really the kind of ones that stood out. And one of the most interesting and beautiful ones, I guess, is kind of a cliche, was Ramsey Creek, the original one, down in South Carolina. And my husband and I went on a tour. One of the tours that we took was down to Florida and back up. And there was a sense of history there that simply because it's been around the longest, that I think stood out for me. And it was beautiful, and it was well laid out. But I have to express a personal preference for the one in South Jersey, where I buried my parents. And that's partly, I think, because it's as local as I could get to my place, and being local has a lot of appeal. And anybody, we'd love to be buried in our own hometowns, but at least being buried in my own state
Mhm.
makes a lot of difference. So yeah, so it's I saw a lot of them, and I loved them all, and I loved the cemeterians, but I think those two, Steelmantown and Ramsey Creek, really stood out. And where will you be? Oh, well, you might. Oh, that's right. You might 10 minutes. But aren't you near? Are you closer to Oklahoma than you are to any of because there are burial places in Texas?
The closest burial to me is in Oklahoma, even though I'm in Texas. I'm pretty far north in Texas.
Okay, so you're not, yeah, because I mean, there's Georgetown and Austin. Well, actually, Eloise Woods has changed hands, but and then there's George, what's his name? I can't remember. Down near Houston, there's one, and there's one near San Antonio, but those are all further south than you are.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Different ones.
Yeah, I plan to go visit them when we get down south a little bit, but we don't have any plans to travel that far south in Texas just yet.
Well, at least you visited one, and that's actually that's an important thing.
And I did not get to visit the natural embalmer that you have listed in the book. There's one, I think it was Enid, Oklahoma. I really wanted to go visit them and
Yeah. Mhm.
see what that's all about. But maybe next time we chat, I can talk to you about that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, that's a whole other interesting, interesting subject, and where that all fits in with. Well, you also there's a National Home Funeral Association, which is an interesting organization that you might be interested in. I've been to their convention and stuff like that. There's a lot of really good people out there doing peripheral parts of the whole green and slash natural burial world. So yeah.
Yes, I have a colleague who's in seminary school, and she was telling me about the Home Funeral Association. And last time she and I talked, she was talking about different ways to keep a body at home, either using dry ice or ice packs and keeping them cool at home until you can have the natural burial without embalming.
Well, of course, we used to call funeral parlors. I mean, the front rooms of old Victorian houses used to be parlors. That's where people laid the bodies out and stuff like that. So, we these days we don't do that, or people are starting to. But I chose not to do that for either my parents. But you have to have somebody, I think, that you trust and are interested in doing that. So.
I think it would be really interesting for us to get to a point in our society where we haven't outsourced the care of our dead, where it's something that we do. We're outsourcing the care of our elderly family members rather than caring for them in the home, which is what would have been done previously. And
Right.
even in other cultures, they have more multi-generational families. And so to hopefully make that more a part of our culture and bring that back so that we're not, I guess, weirded out by dead bodies, and that it is something normal that we could care for our own dead instead of outsource it.
Oh, I've lost you. Can you see me?
I cannot see you, but I can hear you. Let me see if I can.
Oh, I think. Uh-oh.
Well, that's okay. We can still hear you. Maybe now's a good time to take questions from people who have been listening. Feel free to unmute yourself, or if you need me to, I can unmute you. You may just have to send me a chat. Oh, Michael, you're unmuted. Did you want to chime in with something? I asked to unmute for our other two guests, just in case you wanted to chime in. If not, that's okay. Michael, can you hear us? Anne, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. I'm not seeing you, but I'm definitely here.
Okay, let me see. I'm going to try one more thing to see if we can get your video to come back. We'll see.
Oh, there I am.
Yay!
Yes. Well, this has actually been really good to talk to you, Veronica. I mean, I think you have a different perspective on death and all, and that's important within the whole certainly green burial world, because I think we tend to go around in these little circles, and like in any field, you tend to get narrow focus, but it's nice to hear your aspect and stuff.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Do you have an interest in becoming like a death doula? Or, I mean, there's so many different, of course, there's home funeral assistants, and there's a variety of ways in which people um, enter the world, but that may not be what you're.
I do have an interest in that, and I'm still exploring what I want my role to be as I grow in my consulting practice and my geriatric practice. I'm still working out what that looks like, but I definitely have an interest in that. And I've even talked to my husband. I think it would be fun for us to have a natural burial cemetery, for
Mhm.
us to retire to find a place that we love and think is beautiful and help people get to bury their loved ones in a very natural and meaningful way.
Yeah, it's interesting if you do that. Lots of places it's easier to get an existing cemetery and expand it. I forget about Texas rules and stuff like that, but it's all. I mean, well, what do you do with your client? Do you give information about green burial or things with people that you're talking about in your geriatric practice, or how do you?
Well, we talk about deprescribing or decreasing the medication burden, particularly as we see that there's no benefit as we're nearing the end of life. And so having those conversations about what can we let go of, what pieces of care can we let go of, and also talking about preparing for the process and encouraging patients to have those conversations before they're losing their faculties, that
Mhm.
these are conversations that they need to be having, because we can choose different medical care. I find that there's a misconception in that we have no control over how we die. And it's actually not
Mhm.
true, but we have to start making decisions much earlier on in our healthcare in order for us to choose how we die and
Mhm.
know what kind of care to say no to in order to have the death that we want.
Right, right. Well, do you bring is how one deals with one's body at the end? Is that part of your conversation, or you don't really?
It does come up. I feel it out. We focus more on the healthcare aspect and choosing care and having different choices in the healthcare journey. But I
Mhm.
certainly bring it up and just mention that they have options, and have they thought about it? Have they talked about it with their loved ones? And
Do you find that people have thought about it? I mean, I don't mean green burial even, but do you find that it's something that has come up before, or people just don't bother?
it depends. It varies pretty widely. I would say more often than not, people haven't talked about it unless they've recently lost a loved one, like a spouse or a sibling, and then they're a little more motivated to be like, "Wow, I really had to do a lot of work because my sister or spouse didn't have these things done beforehand, and I don't want someone else to be in that position when I go." So I see a lot of that, that they're more willing to have the conversation after they've lost someone close to them.
Right. Well, of course, the interesting thing is you haven't asked me if I have if I have any plans for my body after death.
What are your plans?
I don't know. It's like that, like the psychiatrist can't go to the doesn't want to go to a psychiatrist. I do have to decide, but it's like I don't know.
So
Oop,
for
that's
you having this marine background and for living on the sailboat, you're on the sailboat now. Is burial at sea an option for you?
I don't think so. No, no, I think I'd rather be over there and land.
Okay.
I I just have to decide where, and together we have to do it, and not leave it to somebody else. I think that's the answer. Not leave it to the next person. We don't have children, but somebody's going to have to deal with our body. So yeah. So I must go, Veronica. My time is up, and can you see the moon?
Oh, it's beautiful. It's gorgeous.
So there you go. So, well, this has been a pleasure. And, I really appreciate your inviting me to be on your show.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your expertise. And I look forward to uploading this for others to hear your wisdom and learn about the resource that you've given all of us for green burial.
Good. Well, and I'm glad Michael's in my book. There you go.
Yes. Thank you for joining us, Michael. And
All right. And we'll talk, Veronica, okay?
sounds good. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Did you have a podcast?